So I've been, watching Brett Weinstein's channel for quite a long time, his Dark Horse podcast, and his interviews, and I've had this impulse to make these little snippets based on little sections of his talks lately, and this is the first time I've done so. So I'm going to see if I can cut in here the actual clip. So he has a discussion with Professor Desmond. Professor Desmond is the psychologist, sociologist that popularized the idea of mass formation. And in the course of the discussion, Brett talks about his time at Evergreen. And he talks about how he came up with this model right as he was being hunted down for being a racist, a white supremacist, whatever happened to him, the story that happened to him at Evergreen, which was like a little death, right? And he actually, so he comes up, I wrote in my notes, Brett Weinstein happens upon the Griardian insight into the importance and the impact of Christ's life, his death, and his resurrection practically in our world. And the way that he comes across it, he said that he was writing on his board the process of witch hunts, and he has four stages in this model. I'm going to let him, he says, a little bit better, but ultimately he comes up to the conclusion that it's the witches that ultimately destroy the mass formation, destroy the mob mentality that emerges in this phenomenon of mass formation, right? So the witches, ultimately the scapegoat, are ultimately the answer to short-circuiting the mob mentality. And that is the story of Christ, especially as Gerard tells it, of the scapegoat being innocent. And that fact is what reorients the world. And he's showing, and he's saying he came across this separately, and I believe him. I think he's read some Gerard, I think since, though. I don't know if he read before. But he came across this insight as he was being hunted down, and he lost his job, which is like a small death. He lost his income, he lost his livelihood at Evergreen. But that prepared him for the bigger death, right? The bigger challenge, which was making sense of COVID. And he's been, relatively as accurate in his predictions as I've seen. But there's a lot of these times in his conversations where he happens upon like the fundamental Christian story, and he's completely unaware. I think, I don't know if he's completely unaware, but he's not explicitly saying that this is the story of Christ. But anyways, let me know what you guys think. I'm just going to play the snip from here, and then I'll see you guys in the comments.
Understood anymore why suddenly this group had to be destroyed or had to be deported to the gulags. Nobody understood it anymore. So that's the blind, irrational destructiveness that is typical for the masses, and that in the end leads to the fact that, to use the words of Hannah Arendt, the masses in the end typically become a monster that devours its own children. So
the problem is the monster devours its own children. I totally agree with this, and I'm a big fan of Hannah Arendt. The problem is that the people who constituted the mass continue. And so evolutionarily speaking, the fact that the mass does not persist does not mean that the mass was counterproductive to the evolutionary, I'm going to use the term loosely, objective. And this is what I hope we can wrestle out of this, is that there are two processes in human beings that are hereditary. One of them is genetic, and the other is cultural. There are more, but those are the two biggies, a dual inheritance system. And the problem is the genes are the driver from the point of view of the objective of being a creature, including a human. But in humans, the much more interesting part is the software level, right? And that software level can believe different things at different times. But in some sense, if you were to go back through the history of belief of your own lineage, and you were to trace it back, obviously this becomes impossible before the invention of writing. But let's say you could go back 1,000,000 years into your own lineage and look at all of the things that your ancestors believed. None of them were a failure. They were mostly wrong, literally, but they did get you here. And so that's the question, is mass formation to me looks like an adaptive pattern, and it is confusing to us because the content of it is so upside down that we think this just has to be madness, which is in fact why people put the term psychosis on, right? This appears to be a madness. But the problem is a true psychosis is a dysfunction, right? It is a failure to understand the world. And while the individual wrapped up in the mass fails to understand the world, to be certain, they may well be in the better position to get to the next chapter than the person who says, hey, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Right. And that is, I think, the most disturbing thing about this is that the evolutionary story does not offer us comfort just because the mass fails. Right. The mass doesn't really fail. That's not what happens. And just a couple more things. In fact, there's no reason that you would necessarily know, but do you know why I ended up in the public eye or how that happened? Do you know the Evergreen story?
Yes, I think I know it. What happened? But please.
Well, I won't say terribly much, except that my wife and I were extremely popular professors at a small, very liberal college. And we had a very devoted and wonderful community of students that we taught evolution. And as the woke revolution took over the college, I initially ended up in a confrontation with my faculty colleagues. And that confrontation with my faculty colleagues resulted in a group of students that I had literally never met arriving at my classroom and demanding that I be fired for racism. Now, I'm no racist. I'm quite the opposite. But it didn't matter to them. It was quite clearly a little mass. But here's the reason I raise it. 2 days before that happened, I put a model on the board. And the model, this was something that I was generating in my own head as I was watching myself turned into the witch in preparation for a witch hunt by my colleagues. And so I was hashing this out with my students and trying to explain to them what I thought was unfolding. And I wrote this model on the board that every witch hunt has 4 groups in it, right? One group is the tiny number of people who will initiate a witch hunt. Then there's a small but substantial group who will go along with the witch hunt, right? Then there's a large number of people who will say nothing. And then there is a small number of people who resist, and those are the witches. Now, as I was going through your book with my wife, Heather Hying, last night, I found you have that model. You have it divided in 3, but it's the same model and it has the same punchline, right? The punchline is your source of witches is the resistors to the mass formation. Now, when I wrote that on the board, I didn't know anybody else had a model like that. I didn't know what mass formation was. But the point is, in facing one, it became apparent that this was its inherent structure, right? Now, I faced a little tiny mass, right? Inside my college, a few hundred people were highly animated by a nonsense story that our college was being taken over by white supremacy, right? Which couldn't have been farther from the truth. So anyway, I got to see a little miniature version of it. I mean, I was literally hunted on this campus. They were looking for me. I was the witch in their eyes, which was a completely bizarre experience.
I heard the story before.